Welcome to We Got Balls, real, raw, masculine sex talk with Chris Inman and Scott Cohn. Chris and Scott both work with men who want to leave their unwanted sexual struggles in the past. They are willing to do whatever it takes to help men get curious about what drives their compulsive sexual behavior. With that said, here we go.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of We Got Balls, and this week we're going deep. And by deep, I mean it's going to be a penetrative episode, one in which we really strap on all the truth that we have and give it to you full bore. So this is what we're here for, guys. We are here to make sure you feel it. Feel the truth, feel the compassion, and feel a little bit of titillation. That's what this is about. We Got Balls is in the house. So, guys, this week we're talking about what are you laughing about, Scott?
I'm just thinking about I was gonna welcome all the wives that are listening to this episode with their husbands, because we're hearing from a lot of wives or their husbands tell us, my wife listens with me and she loves your podcast, which is it's really amazing to me because, and I said, really, what is she like? You know, I said, some guy came to me last week and said, my wife loves listening to your podcast with me. I'm like, really? Why? And he said, because she feels like she's in the locker room with the rest of us.
The guys. So this one's for the ladies. For the ladies. We're talking about pegging. And if you don't know what pegging is, don't Google, don't just keep watching. We'll develop all the aspects of pegging for you in this episode. Don't have to look it up. If you've not heard of it, it is I would say, what do you think, Scott? Relatively recent development in the porn world, in the sexual arousal world. I mean, let me say this. It's not new in the sense of what it stimulates. It's new in kind of how it's being marketed and promoted in pornography. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think since about 2000, and the research that I looked at tracked kind of in the category of anal sex, and then where this fits in as a subcategory from 2000 to 2023, kind of the increase in this category. And so let's just define our terms here. Pegging is when a woman wears a strap-on dildo while anally penetrating a straight man, although the term can be used to describe kind of regardless of gender roles. But that's kind of the genre overall. And there was a really popular kind of category, like a production of this called Bend Over Boyfriend. So this is where this really got started as a thing. But as we're going to talk about, there's a lot of reasons why this is an attractive category to both men and women. So,
well, and let's answer the elephant in the room. We have yet to do an episode on dildos, obviously, because many times dildos are focused on penetrative arousal for women. And that's typically how that's seen. But we can't dismiss the fact, and we've talked about anal sex and talked about prostate massage and talked about prostate stimulation. So obviously the prostate is the male G-spot. And when we're talking about pegging or talking about this particular type of arousal, it is having someone else penetrate you as a man using a dildo. Obviously, if it's a man penetrating a man, it'd be anal sex. Wouldn't need to have a strap on for that the equipment is already included. So we just want to make sure that this is, a heteronormative, husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend thing where the woman is assuming a place of power, but we're also scratching that itch to where the man is being able to be pleased passively so, and he has a penetrative orgasm using an instrument, a dildo typically, so that he can enjoy this without being the one who is initiating the sexual content.
That's right. So let me just run through some facts and figures because I found a lot of fascinating research. This is according to women's.health.com. 16% of sexually active adults have engaged in pegging. Sales of pegging gear have risen 44% since 2018 because you have to have the dildo and you have to have kind of a harness that the female wears around her body. 24% of heterosexual male college students have experienced some form of anal pleasure. So it's pretty common for guys to do this on their own, using dildos, as you said, using a finger or whatever as they're masturbating as teenagers discovering their body, and they continue that. Almost 60% of men have reported fantasizing about receiving anal sex, being on the receiving end of it. So that's a pretty high figure.
That would be a majority, Scott. In the math world, we call that a majority.
That is a majority. About 40% of women report fantasizing about pegging their male partners. So,
okay.
This is
so that's an interesting little tidbit. I think before we kind of get into the power dynamics, why would a woman fantasize about penetrating her partner, her male partner?
Well, I think it's a fascinating kind of role reversal, right? We've all
There's
kind
that
of
word
wondered,
again, that fascinating word. It keeps coming back. Everything has to do with the penis. It's so fascinating.
Erect penis.
So
you gotta kind of put yourself in. Well, I think you have to be honest about this. We've all probably done this. Like, if I'm making love to my wife, I wonder, what does that feel like for her? She's got to wonder, what's it feel like to have a penis and penetrate him? I think this particular activity allows both couples to, both of the parties to explore that in a mutually fun way, because both of them obviously, there's a high degree of mutuality here in this. Here's some of the other things. There's a lot of shame around talking about this, because obviously it seems gay to want to be penetrated if you're a man, but 75 or 79% of men said they would be embarrassed to ask a female partner to finger their anus, but 16% admit to fingering their own anus. So again, this is a behavior that guys have engaged in on their own. And anal play is practiced by adults about half the time they engage in sex and sexual play. So it's not all that uncommon. And I've got just tons of research on this, but, we talk about the Pornhub annual review. This is a category, particularly to pegging, not anal sex in general, but the category of pegging is one of the fastest trending, longest viewed forms of pornography on Pornhub. It's extremely popular from all these different things that we're looking at. And another study from the National Survey of Family Growth, thousands of people between 15 and 44. This was done between 2006 and 2008. 44% of the straight men reported having anal sex at least once in their lives. So again, this might be part of somebody's arousal template because they had early experiences with it, or maybe something to just experiment with. But I thought this was fascinating. This was another worldwide study of more than 1 million people. So this is a huge sample size, Chris. And worldwide, men reported that 31 from 2001 to 2022, it went from 31 to 43% of men who were engaged in anal play of some kind, and pegging went from 16.6% to almost 20%, 19.9% in that same 21-year period. So even worldwide, this is a thing. And that's why we're talking about it.
Well, and I think one of the reasons that we're talking about is twofold. Number one, the penises are everywhere. I mean, we were just at a retreat this past weekend, and one of the topics was because men like to play with their penis. I mean, literally, it was just, and this was a religious men's retreat, so it's not like it's permeated everything. So anytime we talk about penetrating or being penetrated, there's going to be some curiosity around that. The other thing is, and I think this is probably where we're going to spend most of our time in this conversation, is so much in a man's life is wrapped up around the idea that I have to create my own pleasure and security and connection. It's up to me. I mean, that's really the definition of masculinity, is to initiate, that I've got to be the one that goes out and creates the revenue to provide. I've got to be the one that finds the girlfriend, or I've got to be the one that, ask someone to marry. I got to be the one that takes responsibility for fixing the things around my house, for making changes in my relationship, for doing my own recovery. I mean, like, the list never ends. There's always something to do. And in this arousal template, it really is something being done to me. So if I'm aroused by this, I can sit back and let somebody else who typically, maybe even for most of our relationship, has been the recipient of my initiation and my action, return the favor and also give me sexual pleasure and be a little bit of novelty, a little bit of variety in this, that I'm being penetrated anally by my female partner, and so there's a little bit of the, maybe I'm bad because I like to do this, but it's not, in that place where sometimes we have to go outside and invite in a third party, or maybe even the aspect where we're talking about gender issues and moving into transgender attraction. But it's just risky enough. It's just novel enough that it feels like it might be, quote unquote, acceptable and okay. And yet, again, we don't shame any consensual sexual action between partners. We don't shame it. But there is a piece of this when you get it once or you get it twice, or you haven't dealt with the stories in your past, it can become a compulsive behavior that you get turned on by this through porn or through acting out with people that you're not in a relationship with, which can become dysfunctional and unhealthy and addictive. So we have to talk about it all to get it kind of in the gumbo, as I like to say down here on the Gulf Coast. But for you, Scott, when you hear about those power dynamics and the relational pieces and even the shame, what comes up for you?
Well, the way I looked at this was kind of from our framework of the sensory kind of cues. So we've talked a lot about visual cued sexual interests, but I think it really that category. I was thinking about it today as I was doing the work for the study on this. I think it needs to be expanded to sensory cues, because there are scents, right? There are tastes, there are tactile sensations that are sexually arousing or part of our cued sexual interest too. So I'm kind of expanding that category, because when I looked into this, and I used a book, Touch, it's a great book on just the nature of that sensory experience of touch. And they had a chapter in there on sexual touch. And there's really the factors, and we covered this in our anal sex episode, so I won't go into real detail here. But again, there's 3 different nerves that innervate the male periogenital system, and one of them really keys on the nerves of the anus, the prostate, and the scrotum, and that's the pudendal nerve. Those nerves kind of bring all of those sensations together. The other 2 aspects that you have to consider is all of these areas of the body that are stimulated through this activity are like our lips, nipples, and our glands on our penis, because they're globulous tissue and there's no hair follicles there. So they're very sensitive to touch, and they have specific sense receptors at the end of them that are called genital end bulbs. So your anus has these, and it's very sensitive to touch. And so this area can be very pleasurable to be stimulated, as well as the prostate, which is inside the anus. Obviously, you have to reach inside.
So all that was just saying it feels good. It feels good to play with my butt, right? Is that what you're telling me?
To play with your butthole and what's deeper up inside. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, awesome.
So this is why, and I think we talked about this, that a finger in your anus or another object is very much erotic, and it can feel like, but it depends, it's context dependent. So think about this. If your lover is doing this to your lips, it's going to be a turn on. But if your doctor is doing that, it's in a completely different context.
Yeah, I never got turned on by my doctor touching me in any way, frankly.
However, you can go to the doctor for a prostate exam and experience an unwanted and unintended erection, because it's stimulating those nerves directly. So that just shows that this area of touch is extremely arousing. Then you've got the psychological cues. So we've talked a lot about those, and that's where we'll probably spend a lot of time with the narrative elements as well. But, the power dynamic is definitely at play here. So you could put this in the category of femdom or femdomination. I think some people would do that. It's kind of a subcategory of BDSM activity, but it's where the female kind of dominates the male. Now, there could be a more tender, just relaxed, novelty-oriented experience of that, or it could be very kind of aggressive. And then I think you have to ask, where are the aggression dynamics coming from? And that would be maybe some narrative cues, something in my story. Maybe I was molested by a babysitter, or maybe my mother was really harsh and critical with me. And so to kind of relax, I have to lay back and allow this part of my arousal template to kind of unfurl in order to experience arousal. I think there's definitely a taboo element of this, and that brings in kind of the risk, right? Element, because I'm doing something that transgresses masculine norms. Men are not supposed to enjoy anal stimulation, which is why 79% of men.
Hold on. Time out. So men are not supposed to enjoy anal stimulation. And yet, for the history of sexuality, we've had dildos, and men have been the one who predominantly used dildos up until the 20th century, the sexual revolution, right? I mean, there's been a little bit of that before then. So, talk to me about what is shameful about anal penetration.
Well, it's gay.
Okay, it's gay. So if I like something up my butt, it's gay.
That's what we tell ourselves. I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying,
so in the Western world, in the religious Judeo-Christian ethic, even Muslim ethic, I would say, there is a shaming of this is not the way it's supposed to work. Now, obviously, from a procreation perspective, you can't have a baby with anal penetration and ejaculation. But there is this aspect that I think it's important to destigmatize, consensual self-play or consensual play with other people that we have a relationship with. And I think part of that it's gay thing has kind of been dumped in this sexual stew of shame, is that anything that's outside of the quote unquote right way to do things, which is missionary position in your marriage bed with your wife, and I'm not knocking that either, FYI. I'm just saying that I think that the aspect of compassion and curiosity has just really been divorced. And this is one of those topics that really stands out. When we talk about this, there's a way it can be really unhealthy and destructive, but there's also a way it can be actually very connective and cathartic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at when you talk about kind of what are the cultural norms for masculinity. A man is always to be the penetrator, never penetrated. A man is to be the initiator, even though most men would love it if their wives would initiate, for God's sake. But, there's all these expectations that culturally are imposed upon us. They seep into us kind of through osmosis. It's not like anybody sits us down and goes, now here's how a man's supposed to have sex, right? But you hear it growing up, you absorb it in the locker room, you see it in pornography. And I think kind of as we kind of deal with shame around sexuality in general, which I think is a good thing. I don't think we should be ashamed of enjoying sex. And I don't think we should be ashamed of exploring different ways to feel sexual and enjoy sexuality in a marital relationship. But I think it's that kind of has opened up, then it's opened up these opportunities for people to be more exploratory in different ways of enjoying pleasure with one another. But you still have that notion. And I think you see it in that research where it said 79% of men would be afraid to tell their spouse that they wanted to be pegged. Why is that? Because they're afraid their wife is going to go, well, you must like gay sex then. And the reality is only 40% of men ever engage in anal sex. It's not really a gay thing. So, and
the reality is, and I don't know if the research can back this up, but I know our story experience with guys and stories is the majority of guys who are turned on by anal sex is because they've had some sexually abusive or harmful dynamic that has been thrust upon them when they were young, or they didn't feel like they fit in and they thought they needed to conform to this gay identity, and they began to experiment, whether with other people or with dildos themselves. And so there's this wrapped around the identity of who I am and what's normal and good for me that, synced up with this sexual desire, this arousal template. So, in all the things that we do, we want to offer extreme amounts of compassion and curiosity for men's stories. And the biggest piece for this is I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe that I can tell somebody what's really going on with me, what I really want, what really turns me on. And if you say it a lot of times, it loses its power. Not that it's not an arousal template anymore, but it loses the power to be dominant and shameful and cause dysfunctional behavior and compulsive and addictive disorders.
That's right. And, and I've had guys come to me who are obsessed with this. They are obsessed in terms of wanting their wife to do this with them. And and I'll say, well, why don't you just tell your wife, hey, I would love to explore this. We don't have to do it, but this is something that I desire. Because I'll stop and just say one of the sexiest things I ever did with my wife is we were driving on a long road trip. And I said, hey, let's make a list of all the sexual things we wanted to do with one another that we've never done yet. And here's the rules. We get to share them one by one, and we can only respond in one of three ways to the other person's desire. Ooh, that sounds really cool. We can do that whenever you want. That sounds really cool, but I'm only comfortable doing that when I initiate that. Or that sounds really cool, but I'm just not ready to go there right now. So that
very
was
compassionate. I love those compassionate frames to respond.
Yeah,
all yeses and not judgmental.
Exactly. And it created that safety in us being able to tell each other what we want. Guess what? We each had 10 items. Most of our items matched. She wanted to do the same things I wanted to do. And it was, and then what we had was a list of things that we could go down and experiment with and have fun. Who doesn't want to do something like that? So I think that's an invitation when you're having a hard time having a conversation just in general about what you desire, let alone pegging, is to take a technique like that and invite your spouse into that. And if she won't come into it, then the question is, why not? What is it that makes exploring desire so threatening in the relationship? And so
you mean she won't come into the conversation, that open conversation is what you mean, right, Scott?
Right.
Yeah.
So nope, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk. Can we talk about talking about it? No. Now we have in a different discussion. What is it that makes our desires so threatening to one another? And so there's a story there typically, right?
Absolutely. And so in that vein, Scott, when you're talking about that, it really invites this piece around sexual arousal that maybe we've talked about. I'm sure we have talked about it, but I just want to put a highlighter on it for just a moment, is that until we talk about the things that we really desire, the shame will continue to eat us alive. I have a fairly popular arousal template. There's a lot of guys that share my things that turn me on. And it's a lot of it because we were raised in similar environments, similar dynamics. And I kept quiet about it for 20 years. In fact, it was probably 20 years until I even thought about the fact that what turned me on actually pointed towards what I really wanted in my childhood. And I grew up with it, and it developed into arousal, and it truly began to shape me as an adult man. And those things were exciting to me because I wanted those as a kid. And so the fact that I began to talk about them and understand why they turned me on and why they brought me to a place of sexual arousal was really, really healing. And just to be able to communicate anything around sex in a safe way was very healing. I was sitting with a group of guys probably 5 years ago, and we sat around, and one of the weeks we got on sexuality, and I talked about a few things around sexuality. And one of the guys said, I've never had an open and honest conversation around sex with other guys that was safe. Never had it. And so I said, okay, well, next week, let's get together and let's just talk about whatever you want to talk about. And we didn't talk about anything, it was mild compared to We Got Balls. It's pretty tame. So, but at that point in their development and where I was, it was a great opportunity and invitation to this space. So let's get real particular with this particular arousal template. And let's look at two things in the last couple minutes that we have. Number one, why would a guy want to be pegged? And number two, why would a woman want to peg a guy? Very curious about those two things.
Okay. So Really simple. It comes down to those three things. What's going on in your body and your nervous system. So that's the biology, the neurobiology. Some men may have more nerve endings in their anus and their penis than in their scrotum, and that might make pegging more pleasurable for them. It might also be that their brain structures, based on experience, were differentiated and wired together for this. So there's Hibbs axion neurons that fire together. So if you had an experience in youth that was kind of novel, where you were masturbating and you used a dildo or whatever, and it resulted in a really intense orgasm, and you're like, oh, I'm going to do that again. This might be something that becomes a part of your sexual repertoire because it felt so overwhelmingly stimulating. So there's where practice kind of impacts your brain structures and what you sense in your body. But again, so much of this is going on in the brain, not just necessarily what's happening in your penis or your anus.
Well, and let's be clear. There's the brain and then there's the mind. The brain is what sits in my cranium. The mind is my entire nervous system. So everything that's connecting together is part of what I'm thinking, feeling, experiencing is my mind. And so any sexual arousal in my body is affecting and being impacted on what I would call my mind.
And your experiences with others, right? They're the more formative things. So then the other things that can impact your brain structure and how your mind is working is the intensity of the emotion involved in the experience. So did you have an experience where this resulted in both arousal or fight, flight, kind of anger or fear? So eroticism gets fused with an emotion of some kind. Shame would be another one. We've shared honestly about my sexual abuse experience. I was raped when I was 17. Clearly my arousal in that story was fused with anal penetration. So this is...
or even being caught masturbating using some device as to anally stimulate yourself can be that as well.
The intensity of the sensation, we call this valence, the balance between pleasure and pain. This can be a very pleasurable experience, but it can also be painful. So if you're forcibly penetrated, it's not going to feel really good. But if that occurred in an abusive situation when you're a child, you can see then like you might want to go back and repeat that unconsciously in an attempt to reverse the harm of that experience. And yet it's bound up in your arousal template that somehow I have to experience pain to kind of enter into this experience. So that's confusing, but it happens. There's definitely the novelty of it. And then there's the repetition. All of those things work into kind of the physiological aspect of this. Then you go to the psychological cues. We talked about power over and under. Again, if it was an abuse, if you experienced anal sex in an abusive environment, you may want to go back and repeat this in a way so that it's your choice to submit to it instead of being forced into it, which allows you to kind of reverse the harm of your abuse. Or just psychologically, if you felt like your mother was a source of harm and always kind of screwing you, so to speak, maybe this is again as a way for your partner to kind of symbolize your symbolic victory over your mother's enmeshment and over her emasculation of you. So you've got those elements of eroticized rage, eroticized fear, eroticized shame. All those are creating a supernormal stimulus as well, which makes this sexual activity much more exciting than probably regular penetrative sex at times, as well as the novelty. And then again, we've talked about the narrative cues. I'm reenacting, I'm trying to repeat or reverse, or there's something about self-formation in this. How does this help me feel like I become more of a man or I become more masculine? So
I have consent and power to submit to this, which makes it safer, more pleasurable. It reworks in my brain whatever harm might have been there, be it relational or experiential or traumatic or whatever. At least I take back the power, even though I'm being penetrated, I'm still consenting.
That's right. So, we're not trying to shame pegging at all. It could be a really pleasurable experience you could enjoy with your partner. But if you're bothered by it, if you feel a lot of shame in the activity, if you feel like you are, anally masturbating with dildos or whatever, and you need to keep it hidden, it's maybe an invitation to kind of examine your story and when this particular form of pleasure entered your life and how it's serving you, and to be curious about that. If you feel like you're kind of violating your values, if you feel like you're doing something wrong, maybe be curious about what it is that it's how it's serving you, how it's helping you, and be kinder to yourself in exploring this part of your arousal template and how it came to be.
Yep. That's a great sum up. We didn't talk about whether or not why women like to do this.
Oh, we didn't.
We want to talk about that?
So why do women want to do this, Chris?
That's a great question, Scott. Thank you for asking. I think there is a sense in which women feel like they've been screwed themselves many, many times over. I mean, obviously, for what many consider the weaker gender or someone who's had to put up with a lot of other stuff, there can be a cathartic experience of playing a masculine role and penetrating someone who maybe even has been the cause of a lot of their pain and struggle. And so kind of, as we talk about arousal being sometimes a reversal dynamic, this is the woman penetrating the man when usually it's the other way around. So you have a embodied, and as much as can be, you're wearing a harness and a dildo. It's not really your penis you're using, but you're simulating it. And that experience of watching someone else be penetrated and receive pleasure through the penetration can be a thing of healing and catharsis for a woman. It may just be also they like to make their husband happy and they'll do whatever he wants to do, and they're doing it kind of, I don't really care one way or the other. But I think when we talk about that, it's really important to recognize that there is a balance in relational dynamics. Just even today, I was sitting with my wife and she was having a very visceral experience about something that was going on. And one of the things that I needed to do is acknowledge how I was feeling in the moment, but also be sensitive to how she was feeling in the moment. We got to work through that. So I think with our partners, with our spouses, it's just like Scott said earlier, to demand that they do it is just as harmful as them to say, no, I'll never do it, or let's not talk about it. I don't want to talk about that stuff. But to have a conversation and come to those places and say, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds something like I do. Yeah, maybe if I initiate it, we can do it. Or I appreciate you sharing that with me, but that's not really something I'm interested in. It's very connective. And so to allow a woman to have that experience, I think would really, really, really help her come toward you if you have a female partner who you want to become more intimate with sexually.
Absolutely. That's what intimacy is. What are my desires? Am I able to be honest about what I really long for? Understanding that I'm not always going to get my needs met by you in this particular instant, but for the most part, they will be. And that's part of our healing too, is to realize that our partner is a source of honoring our desires, not 100% of the time, but it's that invitation to, here's what I would really like. You don't have to do this. But I think that's what a healthy relationship is all about, letting our desires be known and giving the other person a chance to respond to that.
That is emotional intimacy, and that is the key to any connective relationship. So absolutely, Scott. That's exactly what we want to do. And so, guys, if you're curious or compassionate towards yourself, reach out to us. Let us know how we can support you. And if you just want to stay on the sidelines, that's cool. So we're going to be back next week on another episode of We Got Balls.
And you do too. And possibly your wife may have a pair.
You're all welcome. See you guys.
Don't forget to subscribe for more episodes. You can connect with Chris at pornfreemasculinity.com and with Scott at successfulmen.com.